hunger strike for 7 days. We've documented he's been on hunger strike for almost 3 days.
The one thing I ask you is when I'm talking to you, be straight up with me, all right? Don't make me find out different.
You walk through the gate at the Louisiana State Penitentiary, and the first number that should scare you isn't the sentence hanging over the man 3 feet away. It's the ratio. On a normal shift, something close to 200 officers work the floor of a prison built to hold roughly 5,000 men. And not one of them is carrying a gun. No sidearm, no rifle. Not once you're past the wall. But the fact that this place has run that way for decades tells you the real story here was never about the weapons. Angola sits on 18,000 acres of old plantation land, bordered on 3 sides by the Mississippi River, roughly the size of Manhattan and about as far from a highway as a place in Louisiana can get. It's the largest maximum security prison in the country. Most of the men inside are serving life, and most of them will die there. My soul is resting. Somewhere around 90% by the numbers the state itself keeps. You can smell it before you see it. Diesel from the farm equipment, cut grass baking in July heat, and under that, a locker room smell that's been sealed inside a dormitory for 50 years. The first thing that breaks the movie version of prison is the housing itself. Forget rows of individual cells with bars. No bars at all, mostly. Much of Angola runs on open dormitories, 60 or 80 men to a room, bunks close enough that you learn a stranger's breathing pattern before you learn his name. There's no door to shut between you and him. There's no wall, just a bunk, a locker, and whatever piece that particular room has quietly agreed to keep. That agreement is doing more work than any lock in the building, and it starts before the sun's even up. The no weapons rule follows standard doctrine across nearly every state prison system in the country, and it exists because of a lesson corrections learned the hard way. In 1971, the Attica uprising in New York showed exactly what happens when firearms end up close enough for inmates to reach. A locked-down armed officer becomes, in the worst moment of his shift, a supply depot instead of a deterrent. By the 1980s, department after department had reached the same conclusion. Officers who work inside the wire, in dorms and dining halls and work lines, carry pepper spray and a radio. That's it. Rifles stay up in the towers, 30 feet behind razor wire nobody can reach without exposing themselves for the climb. It sounds backward until you sit with it. Taking the guns away from the people standing closest to 5,000 men is what actually keeps them alive out there. You feel that rule differently once you're the one standing in a dorm doorway at midnight, with nothing on your belt but a canister and a call button. Training tells you the radio is the real weapon, that 30 seconds of calm talk usually does more than a baton ever could. And most nights, that training is exactly right. But you still notice every single time how close the nearest bunk really is, and how long 30 seconds can feel when you're the only uniform in the room. By sunrise, the work lines are already forming. Angola is still at its core a working farm. 18,000 acres of cotton, soybean and corn, worked almost entirely by prison labour. Men walk out into the rows under towers manned by armed officers watching the tree line, not the crop, because a run for the trees is still what most escape attempts look like out here. By July, the heat sits over 100 degrees, and the humidity turns a cotton shirt into something you're wearing more than breathing through. Horses. Real ones. Some officers still supervise the fields on horseback, and the leather and sweat smell of the tack lines up beside diesel exhaust like 2 different centuries sharing the same stretch of dirt road. For a second, it looks like 1940. It is not supposed to look like that in this century, and that's exactly the detail that unsettles people who see it up close for the first time. Feeding 5,000 men runs on an industrial clock. No days off, 3 full meal cycles a day, tens of thousands of eggs a week, hundreds of pounds of rice moving through a kitchen line faster than any restaurant you've ever stood in. A late delivery turns into a bad afternoon fast because 5,000 hungry men in one place is its own kind of weather system, and everyone on staff has learned to watch it building. Here's where the officer count starts to actually matter. 200 sounds like a real number, until you spread it across a facility the size of Manhattan, split it into 3 shifts, and subtract the sergeants, the tower posts, the transport runs, and whoever training pulled off the floor that week. What's actually left walking a dormitory of 80 men at 2 in the morning is sometimes one person. One officer, unarmed, a radio on the hip, standing between a room full of sleeping strangers and whatever happens if one of them wakes up angry. There's no patrol car pulling up in 90 seconds if that goes wrong. There's no backup 2 minutes away. The nearest help might be a building over, might be a radio call and a sprint across open ground in the dark. And every officer who has worked a night shift here has done that math at least once. Usually alone, usually around 3 in the morning. Violence doesn't disappear just because the guns do. When it happens, officers rely on something closer to a controlled scramble than a shootout. A radio call brings every available body running from across the yard. Batons and pepper spray go up before anything else, and the goal in the first 10 seconds is never to win a fight, only to separate the men involved before it spreads. Anyone who can't safely live in general population because they're a target or because they've become one moves into protective custody, a smaller, tighter set of dorms where movement is slower and the count happens more often. It isn't comfortable, but for some of the men who end up there, it's the only reason they're still alive to serve out the rest of the sentence. The staffing problem isn't a secret to anyone who works there. Turnover among officers at Angola has run as high as 50% in a single year. An entry pay barely clears $14 an hour, low enough that the department has spent years struggling to keep the floor fully staffed. On some understaffed nights, a single officer, often a woman, has been left in charge of an entire all-male dormitory with no one physically nearby if she calls for help. Department officials have called that arrangement unsafe out loud in public hearings on the record. The 200 figure works less like a comfortable buffer and more like a floor the whole system is quietly balanced on. So why doesn't it fall apart more often than it does? This is the part that surprises people who've only seen the movie version of prison. The order inside Angola doesn't come from force. It can't. 200 unarmed people cannot physically overpower 5,000 men. Not for one shift, not for 1 hour. And everyone on both sides of that ratio understands the math. What actually holds the place together is a system built almost entirely on what a man stands to lose. Classification is the real currency here. Good behavior moves a man toward a lower custody level, a better dorm, a job that pays real cents on the hour instead of nothing, a shot at contact visits with his kids twice a month instead of a phone call through glass.
How you get to Angola?
Bad behavior sends him backward, into a cell block where he's locked down 23 hours a day with a mattress and his own thoughts for company. Every man on that yard is running a constant, quiet calculation about which direction he wants to move. That calculation is the actual security system, not with force. Officers aren't holding 5,000 men with pepper spray and a radio. They're managing a population that has, for the most part, already decided it wants the routine to hold, because the routine is the only thing standing between where a man is now and something considerably worse. The warmth in this place is real, and it's stranger than you'd expect walking in cold. Angola runs its own rodeo twice a year. Incarcerated men riding bulls in front of paying crowds from all over the state, selling handmade furniture and leatherwork built in a hobbycraft shop that smells permanently of sawdust and shoe polish. A gospel choir rehearses on Sunday afternoons, voices carrying down a hallway that, an hour earlier, sat dead silent during count. A kitchen worker will bake a cake with ingredients he isn't technically supposed to have for another man's birthday, because 40 years is a long time to go without anyone marking the day you were born. Then the count bell rings, and every one of those men walks back to a bunk 6 feet from a stranger in a room with no lock on the door, and the warmth folds itself back into the routine like it was never there. But the hardest constraint at Angola is time itself, stretched out over decades in a place built to punish, never designed to care for the elderly. Close to 3/4 of the men here are serving life without parole. Most entered young. Most are aging out their sentence inside the same fences they walk through as young men. And by the time they're in their 60s and 70s, the prison has to become something it was never designed to be: a nursing home surrounded by razor wire. That's the part almost nobody expects. The strangest thing in the entire place. In 1998, Angola opened one of the first hospice programs inside any American prison, and it still runs today inside a converted wing that used to be solitary confinement. The cells there have been repainted, given curtains, a television, air conditioning, and a private bathroom, so a dying man doesn't spend his final weeks staring at the same bare walls that punished him decades earlier. The staff running it aren't nurses brought in from outside. They're other inmates, trained for 40 hours before they're allowed to sit with a dying man through the night, men serving their own life sentences who will, statistically, end up in one of these beds themselves someday. If you're the officer walking that wing on a slow Tuesday, you stop noticing the razor wire outside the window before you notice the quiet. No shouting, no count bell, just the low hum of an air conditioner and someone reading scripture out loud to a man who can't respond anymore. It's the last place in the building you'd expect to feel calm, and it's often the calmest room on the whole compound. Picture that for a second. A man convicted of a violent crime as a young man spends his 60s learning to change a dying stranger's sheets, to sit with him at 3 in the morning when the pain medication isn't quite enough, to build his coffin afterward in the same hobbycraft shop that makes the rodeo leatherwork. The numbers back it up. Wardens who've run the place will tell you the violence inside Angola measurably dropped in the years after hospice started, from several hundred violent incidents a year down to well under 100, because caring for a dying man does something to the people around him that a locked door never could. That's the real answer to how 200 unarmed officers hold 5,000 men inside the largest maximum security prison in America. It was never about matching force with force. It's a system where almost everyone inside it, the guard walking a dorm alone at 2 a.m. and the lifer changing a dying man's sheets at the same hour, has more to lose from chaos than they have to gain from it. The rare nights that calculation breaks down are the nights that make the news. The other 12,000 nights a year, it holds quietly, because a man 80 bunks deep decided his daughter's visit next month or his dying friend down the hall mattered more than whatever he was angry about at 11 p.m. You could ask whether that's a system built on safety or one built on leverage that simply learned to look like order. The honest answer is probably both. And the men wearing the uniform and the men wearing the jumpsuits have each made their own peace with that trade, because neither one of them gets to leave the math behind at the end of a shift. If a place like this, built to punish, ends up teaching 200 strangers and 5,000 strangers how to keep each other alive anyway, it might be worth asking what that says about every other system we've built on force instead.